you want to introduce Jeffrey?
Of course. So for our speaker request for this talk, we requested a top secret cleared shaven yak. And the reason for this is that essentially it's our goal here to take all of the mysteries of the paywalled papers and show you how both to break through that paywall and also how to avoid reading papers that feel like you're shaving a yak. You'll notice that the yak is unshaven. We're both academics. We refuse to shave yaks. And if you ever find yourself reading a paper that feels like it's yak shaving, just stop and find a nicer scarf and carry on.
So yeah, we're here to talk about grappling hooks on the ivory tower, this year in practical academic research. And instead of this being a title and subtitle sort of thing, we've actually broken this talk into two sections. So these are sort of our two titles we're working with today. So the two sections we'll kind of be going through are context and information flow and practical papers and examples. The context and information flow is really what is an academic environment? What is happening in it? How do you optimize it? And how do you really break in and get the information out? That information flow part is exactly that. You want to talk about how to get information from academia into industry and back and forth. Then we're going to follow this up with the practical examples. Exactly what is happening in academia that you might not have heard about yet. So as we go throughout this talk, please do ask questions the entire time because the story I like to tell is part of why I wanted to do this talk is I was talking to one of my friends and they said, I fucking hate academics. And I'm like, hi, I'm an academic. And they said, well, but how are you an academic? And I'm like, well, I publish papers, I do the research, I apply for grants, I connect with people in industry, I do all of that work that an academic does. And he said, but you don't act like an academic. And we kept talking about this to the point where, they finally said, well, I still don't understand what an academic is now because I think you break the mold. And through that time, he asked so many questions that we really want to answer here today. So if anything we're saying doesn't make sense or you need clarification, put your hand up immediately. We want to answer everything as we go through. So our first thing that's important when you're talking about context and information flow is why do academics do what they do? Now, most of you probably know citations. Everything is always about citations. For an academic, citations are what get you grants. They also get you any promotions. They get you your funding. They get you any sort of, salary increase as well. The interesting thing about citations is that you can see you have a whole range here. You have some people that $599 sounds pretty good. You've got the $1,500, $2,500, and then you have some researchers that have $13,000. And what these numbers can sort of indicate to you is that these people are collaborating in the community. They've probably got lots of students. They are reaching out to other universities, other groups, and they probably got lots of funding because each one of these things, you have to pay for the student, you have to pay for the materials, you have to pay for any of the resources. So that's also a thing. So the citations indicate those things as well.
I want to add to that too. As an academic that currently doesn't work in academia, I'm a graduate student, but I also have a pen testing job. One of the biggest things, if what you're trying to do is set up some industrial research, if you want a grant for this really cool tool that you're going to develop or something, and you're trying to get it from DARPA, or you're trying to get it from NSF, if you find one that you're eligible for, the best way to establish the kind of cred and a name that can really get people interested in reading your proposal and establishing that you really do know what you're doing. Sure, the merits of the proposal are what is evaluated, but if you have if you know what to cite, if you can cite the important papers in your field to show that you've done your research in that proposal, and if you yourself have been cited in this area, it really helps you to establish credibility. So even if tenure isn't what you're shooting for, this still helps.
Yeah, it's basically like the fake internet points of being a researcher. And the interesting thing here is people think academia is so different from industry. But you know what? we have this exact same workflow, starting from choosing a topic, like what are you here for, what interests you, and then moving into reading materials. This is where academia is a little different from industry, is we spend 4 months on that, or 6, or more, depending what you're doing. For myself, I've been doing lit review for about 3 to 4, maybe 5 months now, just to make sure you have that base for what you're talking about. But then you move into developing your plan. Like, how are you going to tackle this? How are you going to make sure your time is best spent? Then you move into actually like experimenting, making your tool, interacting with the people, getting involved. And usually, like, if you haven't fucked up your experiment, you fucked up your experiment. There's no way you're doing this right the first time. People will be like, yeah, I have a gender-balanced experiment. It's all like, everything else is counterbalanced. It's fantastic. And it's like, how come you only have 1 female then out of 15 participants? You can't even balance across an odd number when you're doing a binary gender balance. And they're like, oh shit. And you realize that after you've completed all your work. So what do you do then? You expand or contract your scope. It's like, okay, well, I've already done the research, maybe I won't do the gender balancing part anymore. Or, I've seen that happen a good number of times. But then you expand or contract your scope. But then from there, when you go through the loop again, you're not choosing your topic, you're modifying your topic. And we've all been there, doing your research, thinking you want to do one thing, and then you realize there's something else. Like when you want to look for something in your house, but then you realize your light bulb's burnt out. It's like, oh, I need to find a light bulb. And then you go to the hallway and you're like, oh, this door is broken, I need to fix the door. And there's like all these steps is kind of what happens when you're doing this part. But then sometimes you end up going through this again, reading your materials, developing your plan, experimenting, and then you get to the point where you're reviewing your shortcomings. You're like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm doing this right. I'm pretty sure the information's correct. I don't understand why this is different. So you go back to reading your materials, and it's like, then you realize the paper you've cited, you look at all the other citations that have come after, and people are sitting there and being like, no, this paper's actually shit. That paper is actually wrong. And that's the thing that happens as well that a lot of people in industry don't understand or don't necessarily take in, is that papers can be wrong too. But what happens there is it's not that paper is completely wrong, it's that paper needs to be improved. And so you look at what cites that paper since it's been published, and you can find the next piece that works on that, or the next piece that works on that. And it's sort of this layering effect of knowledge, not a concrete, this is it forever. That's not actually what happens here. So even in academia, we're still always improving, still going through this iterative process, but sometimes some other people pick this up for you. And then, even from there, you might keep on going. And then at some point, you're going to develop a plan and then realize, as you're developing your plan, the whole idea is shit. You can't actually create it. You can't actually get things done. And we've all been there, right? It's like, I want to do this amazing thing, and then you realize, wait, I don't actually have a quantum computer yet. So then you go straight to expanding and contracting the scope. Then sometimes you get really enterprising grad students, and what happens is you go straight from reading your materials to experimenting. Fuck the plan, we're doing this live. And we've all been there. So
yeah, this is totally a process that we go through differently as well, through different phases of our career as researchers. And one of the things that we find that we do a lot here is that process of narrowing and contracting our scope to match up with what we find is actually possible. And so this is what happens when I'm writing a tool, and I really want my tool to be a perfect disassembler for this strange architecture, or I want my tool to be the universal arm patching tool, and I'm going to put it in Metasploit and see that it works. What you do too is you start to do it, and then you probably will decide, like, maybe I can actually just solve a limited version of this and test the waters and see how it goes. We do that too, and so a lot of the time you'll find some very small studies and they look like they've just shaven a yak. It's this procedure that only works in this one narrow little tiny circumstance that could never possibly happen in reality. And what this is they've said, well, I want to actually publish something before the end of my career. And so I'm going to make this proof about a very specific part of this. And then later on, I or someone else will generalize this.
And that's the important thing is, you know, when you're trying to write a thesis, it has, when you're in academia and trying to write a thesis for either your master's or your PhD, you definitely want to make sure you can actually leave school eventually. I kind of like being a career academic and just constantly learning, but at the same time, it's like, I really want to get a new project one day, and I'm sick of it. And so, yeah, that scope has to be an appropriate size for you to be able to write about one topic, like one very specific topic in its entirety, which is why academics seem to put themselves in a niche. Like, I mean, I do social engineering robots. Like, who's going to hire me for that, right? But, you know, so what does this all lead to? In industry, you know, hopefully this always leads to being able to release the tool, helping other people. You have a question?
What about actually carrying apart experiments into experiment and testing?
If we get the
yeah.
mic so it goes on.
Oh,
Sorry.
all over again?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So how about actually carrying apart experiment into experiment and test?
So from academic side or industry? Yeah. So from academic side, it's part of your plan. So if you go back to this here.
Right, actually expanding out your plan.
Yeah.
Both of them, that was my question.
That's, no, in academia, they are so completely tied together. When you are developing your plan and your experiment, you are deciding right then how you're testing. You are making your rubric for how this passes, for what happens, for what you're actually looking for. Because that's part of being a thorough researcher, is you can't just really go in blind. It's all about, like I said before, you might want to do an experiment that is gender balanced to figure out, for myself, for example, how some of these robots, whether I have a bigger effect on persuading people using a robot if they're female or male. So I know right then or there, I have to split it into female, male. I have to know I'm testing it on both groups. I have to know exactly what my experiment is. I have to know exactly every single step. And then I have to put out every single piece of a survey, every single piece of what I'm doing. And then I have to submit that to an ethics committee before I even get to start. So you're sitting there. Yeah, and you're sitting there and you're doing this, and it's like, yeah, I've worked on this like beautiful, shiny ethics, and it's going to be accepted, and they're going to love it, and they send back a 10-page thing saying this sucks. And so that's it. It is the testing is always part of that, because that's more the important thing is your experiment is your set of tests. So does that answer your question?
If you've done an experiment in academia, as with here, and you haven't tested it and documented your results, it is as though you have not done it at all. That's one of the reasons that we write the paper, is to keep an artifact of what we've done and justify our existence. It's to say, this is my past year of work. We don't often include the failures in this that we're aware of, because there are page limits, of course. You wouldn't know it, but there are. And there's also this other process that we'll get into later, of like the review and then revise and resubmit and shepherding. It's a very different process that's much more artifact focused than what maybe industrial researchers are used to.
Because, like, as a grad student, I stay home all the time. The only way my advisor knows what I'm doing is I write down every single little thing I do. It's like, installed this, took me 4 hours. That needs to be on there. It's like, that's half a day installing these very specific academic tools that only fit on this operating system and this set of requirements. And you find that out as you fuck it up. So it's like constantly, you document your fuck-ups only for your advisor. No one outside of your little tiny community ever sees it.
And remember how I talked about narrow tools are done tools.
Yeah, and so, again, what does this sort of lead to? And in industry, hopefully, when you do your research, or you're trying to do a pen test, or you're doing whatever you do every day, it'll hopefully lead to a promotion for you, or it will lead to a tool, or it will make somebody's life in your company easier, or a happy client. There are all these different metrics. And in academia, we have one. Conferences and journals. This is like the top metric. Everything else sort of falls underneath. Because what conferences and journals are, let's totally cut off, is for us is, again, that permanent artifact that gets put up there. Your name is tied to it like forever. I mean, I've read Turing's paper how many times because that's just one thing that you kind of just get to learn how to read. And all these papers from years and years and years ago, you can still get them. You can still read them. There are people, there are librarians that are sitting there digitizing old copies of papers. So this is the thing, is that this is how we make our lasting mark.
We put these particular journals on the slide because they're particularly poignant ones for our particular segment of the industry. When I go and I'm like, I'd really like to do this cool project, or I think that this new technique would be really useful for my client, these are usually the places that I look. When I do my literature review, every year I do it, I read all of the papers that came out and like sift through and pick which ones are useful and which ones are not. I go through Oakland, Unix, and CCS first, and depending on what I'm looking for, I'll go through some of these other conferences also. And I even make a point of attending IEEE Oakland every single year in order to make sure that these people's work is thrown in my face, to make sure that I'm aware of it, because awareness of the work is kind of a pillar of academia. It is as though someone is going around at a CTF challenge and they've never even heard of smashing the stack for fun and profit. In a big part of my world, this is the same as admitting that you've never read Claude Shannon's entropy paper from the 50s.
And the other thing, too, is I also listed Chi here because there are some venues that are outside security that still talk about security and privacy. Chi, for example, is on human-computer interaction. It's about usability. It's about how people interact with their machines. But they've had actually a fairly large showing for security papers lately. And that's not something that people in this community might be aware of, is that this issue is not only being tackled in our conferences, but almost every other group's conferences as well, because it does affect everyone so fully. Especially with my, I'm doing some technology, privacy, and sexuality research, and that's all in Chi. That's not anywhere else here. And so I really found that interesting, is that if I want to talk about like how people can use teledildonics to make a fingerprint of people using these devices, I don't go to security conferences, I go to Chi. And this is all really interesting because conferences and journals are also slightly different. Like Falcon was saying, conferences have page limits. Most of these ones I like them because the pages are usually limited to 8. You have 8 pages to get everything you've worked on for 6 months out.
My entire taxonomy of language theoretic security flaws that I published in November was 8 pages long and woefully incomplete, but it's that way so that you can actually get through it.
And so this, going back to that cycle of how academics do things, and that narrow focus one more time, is this idea that you have 8 pages, everything needs to go in there, so it's all bite-sized chunks. And that really is a reflection sort of what we do here, because we have the hour-long talks, we have the half-hour-long talks, and that's sort of our soundbite as well. So as you hear stuff like this, I'm sure many of you approach the speakers after. And that's usually what happens with these papers as well, is you want people to approach you after, to collaborate and get those citations. And so this process works kind of like this. You've got the author, and they get the fancy hat, and they submit to a conference. And the conference will look at this paper and be like, okay, what does this actually contain? We need 3 experts to look at this and rip it apart. It is not a nice process. They are trying to make sure that the science is solid and that the information is there and good, if it's a good conference. So it goes up to your reviewers. And there's always reviewer number 2. That is the person that gives you usually the hardest feedback, the one that's like, I think everything's broken and this paper sucks, you should read this other paper that you then find out is actually not anything like your paper, but you have to take that criticism. And these reviewers might be your friends, they might be somebody you've collaborated with. That might be that one fucker that you see at that conference and want to hit every time you see them. but they're still the ones reviewing your work. They still might be the ones that you're constantly interacting with. So, you want to always make sure your work can get through them. Like, if they hate you and they're looking for flaws, your paper still needs to get through them. And then, they do that. They send you back 10 pages of things you need to fix, and you do it. Because this is your work, you need it out. You need to get into that top tier conference. So you do your changes, put it back to conference. And this is where some changes happen is, for some conferences, there's 3 things. It's either completely accepted, holy fuck, that's amazing, blew our minds, yes please. There's also the stage of, we like this, but it really needs polishing. And the third one, which is like, oh fuck, And then some conferences are starting to do shepherding. And shepherding is when they take you through for a while. So they like the paper, but these changes need to happen. So you make the changes. The shepherd's like, you didn't really address these things. Can you try this again? And they'll do it again. So not only have you spent so these conferences we talked about are once a year. You only have one time every year to get your stuff in. It's like the worst thing ever. Because if it doesn't get in, you have to wait an entire year to submit again. So once it's submitted, you get to the conference. And then they start reviewing. That takes 3 months. That 3 months leads into another 3 months of you, or maybe even a month, just changing things back and forth, doing that shepherding process. And then 6 months later, the conference happens, and then the paper gets published. But if it's IEEE or ACM, then no one else gets to access it for a year. So you do this, and then your work doesn't actually get out to the public for 3 years. And so that's part of what we're going to keep on talking about here.
We'll help you get around that a little bit. But the purpose of this process, even though it may seem obtuse, is to ensure that this work is correct and stands on its own merit. One of the things that happens a lot on our side in conferences like this is the reviewer, I've done this, only sees the abstract. And I'm scratching my head and I'm thinking, who are you even? Do you know anything about this topic? What is going to be in this paper? What is the conclusion? Whereas with this process, they get the entire paper as it is going to be in the template that it's going to be in, the format that it's going to be in, and then they get to make that decision. And oftentimes those reviewers, and I've actually had the opportunity to review from that side as well, will be people that have been pulled in from industry, like people that the reviewer has known that are qualified to do the review but aren't a professor anymore. They will say, you're really aware of work in this area because you work in this area. Does the thing that they're saying about the industry that you work in actually make sense? Because the last thing in the world that a journal wants is to be the journal of either badly described research or the journal of research that is just outright wrong and that they keep needing to retract. And
so the other thing here too is that as researchers, we fucking hate reading bad papers. The thing is if we're one of these reviewers, how often do you see papers and it's all formulas or all difficult language, and you see people post these and it's oh, I don't want to read that. Yeah, we get that too. We don't want to be sitting there and doing all this. So when I hear other people saying oh, academic papers are difficult to get through, what I end up hearing is, what have the academics ever done for us? And so, yeah, to just really drive this point home is that the idea of papers is to get people to want to work with you, to get your work out there, to make sure you're changing the world how you can, and having that little bit of an effect on science. So when you do a paper wrong, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. If you're making a paper that no one wants to read, no one's going to read it. And this is a perfect example.
He can't say what the paper is, I'm sure, on Twitter like that. And no one will ever find out, because it's in the Journal of Badly Described Research that no one reads.
Why do people feel like they can get away with never stating, where they got their information from, or contributions, essentially?
So the question is why do people think they can get away with not stating their contributions? Is sometimes people are just really bad at summarizing.
They forget.
Yeah, so some conclusions when you read them is just and then we finished. Thanks?
And it was done.
Yeah, it's more almost like a to be continued. And so that's really hard because we'll get to this in a few more slides, but how to read a paper, one of the first things you do is read the introduction, read the conclusion. And so if they're not meshing and you can't go from one point to the other in your head and think like, yeah, I definitely want to see how this middle part happens, like, fuck, you're writing a bad paper.
There's another point that he makes besides not stating your own contributions. And that point is misstates related work, which you can't get away with misstating your related work. There are certain fields that have certain bodies of work that establish that field. And so if I write a paper about Langsec and I don't cite any of Sergei Bradis's work, people are going to look at my paper and be like, do you know what other people are doing here? Are you reinventing the wheel? Have you checked this for correctness against other things? If you find one that's a seminal paper in your field and you find that it's wrong, you still have to cite it to say, and this one was garbage and here's why. You can't just ignore it. Your paper will be rejected for that.
Yeah, and sometimes the conclusions part of that too is that people, once you've worked on this project for a year and a bit or however long you've been doing it, sometimes you get so sick of it and it's like, I really just want to throw up on this paper at this point. And so you get to the point where you're like, I can't look at this. I've read this one paragraph 50 times. And that's the point I am at one of my papers right now. And it's just like, I'm so happy to be here so I don't have to work on it for a week. And, but I love this work. I think it's amazing and I will talk your ear off if you let me. But it's at the point where I've read my own paper so many times and each part individually, I'll never read it from front to end because it's just, I know it all so well. So it gets to that point where, you think everybody else around you knows what you know because you know it so well. And that's what happens with the conclusions. Yeah. And there's other things here too, is the paper hard to read? And unfortunately, one of the things is checking for poor English. There's a lot of people that are international, using English as a second language. And some of these places pay $5,000 per paper to get somebody to grammar check it and check it for language and all this sort of stuff. And it's somebody who doesn't speak the native language natively, so it's still wrong. And this is something that's really bad because if you get into a certain group that publishes 20 papers a year, that's a lot of money coming out of the school to pay for these grammar checks, which aren't even full. So it's a little unfortunate, and it's something we judge people on, but it's something we're trying not to as much as well. Is the content there? Is it explained well? And that's what should really matter here. And then the last point, incomprehensible graphs. I've seen so many graphs and papers that don't have their axes labeled. I'm like, so you're showing me a picture of bars.
It literally doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Or you find all these pictures in papers and they're not labeled, they're never referenced, and it doesn't seem, none of the numbers that if the axes are labeled make any sense. It's weird. Yeah. It's steganography. So next, how does information flow from academia to industry? Does anybody have any questions before we start?
So the first slide, or the second slide had, yeah. So the first or the second slide had citation count, but it also had two other fields. I'm assuming those are metrics derived from who cites who, like second degree, third degree orders. Can you explain what those two are? I was just kind of curious.
So I don't actually know. And this is one of the great things. I love doing it as an academic. I love saying I don't know. But you know what? I can find out for you within 24 hours and let you know because fuck yeah, I have a question to answer.
You know who does know too? The librarian. And we'll chat about that in just a moment.
Thanks. Have you guys found that when you submit to a conference with a very specific focus and perhaps you're submitting interdisciplinary work, that those reviewers tend to project their own expertise onto your work?
Yes.
Can you maybe speak to that shortly?
So one thing, I do crazy interdisciplinary work. I'm taking robotics, I'm taking sociology, I'm taking psychology, and I'm taking security and privacy and shoving it into one paper. I have close to 85 references on one of my papers. The normal is about, what, 30?
Yeah.
So you end up doing that, and you have to actually prove points that are so simple in other fields, like robots with faces make people want to talk to their face. Like, you think that's kind of straightforward, like for me coming from robotics, but that might not be something a lot of people in this room knew. Or I have to explain that, you know, when a robot acts like an animal, people treat it like an animal, like gasp for me, but that doesn't mean it for anybody else here. So that's another thing too, is something that you do not necessarily have to cite in another field because it is a known, trusted fact that everybody cited for 10 years. All of a sudden you have to find those references for that paper, and you have to create that knowledge and juxtapose it into a different field. And so that's exactly it, is these people like, well, in my field, this shit you're trying to pull doesn't make any sense. And it's like, but in that field, that's standard. So they definitely try and say, I'm the expert here, fuck you. And you're like, no, fuck you.
At risk of running out of time here, I want to talk about this undercurrent just a little more. So one of the things that we do when we're writing papers is we cut out anything that we think that the reader could intuit in order to keep it brief and fit within the page limit and not keep restating things. This we call intuition required from the reader, or how hard is it to read this paper. There is a body of knowledge that everyone in a particular subfield is expected to have, and that body of knowledge is usually the most cited paper in that field. So if you feel that you're lost and you don't understand the terms that people are using, the best place to start is to either ask a librarian, hey, like, what are the important papers in this subfield? Or if you can, use the citation index yourself and see, what does every paper that I'm trying to read and not understanding cite? Let's read that.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, come approach one of us. We are academics. We'd love to help you find this, because this is how we support our community as well as our community. Is there's two that we're trying to balance, but we want this information flow to happen. And this is what is next, is this idea of, you know, this might be you. This might be somebody trying to find that piece of work. And IEEE, ACM, there's there's Degrader, there's, what are the other journals?
Journals, publishers of journals, Springer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that one doesn't exist. Let's just forget about that one.
These are all people who paywall our content. They do so to force people to go to the conference with their research grant budget. It has the effect of making things somewhat inaccessible, but we do have some ways around that for you that we'd love to share.
And number one thing I use as a grad student is Google.
Google Scholar.
Yeah, so Google Scholar, scholar.google.com. Fuck this guy, mint.
They will find the abstract from the index site with the paywall on it in another PDF, and then map the two of them together for you.
And then you get this, 118 versions of the one paper I found. And honestly, the first one might be to ACM. The second one might also be to ACM. It might be to another ACM place. But then you have so many other versions that you can find this website or find this PDF. And that's the great thing, is Google Scholar actually helps you get around these. I hope they don't stop it now because we're bringing attention to it, but it's fantastic. And honestly, the thing a few years ago used to be library search tools, going into your school library and finding that information. But honestly, they don't do the keyword search nearly as well as Google. But the other fun thing here is you get a filter bubble on your research. And this is extremely bad. Because my one friend and I, she does threshold cryptography. Again, I do robots, and we're trying to do mobile research. And I would only get stuff vaguely related to robots. She'd only get stuff vaguely related to public key infrastructure, but it wasn't the mobile permissions that we were looking for. And we'd do the same keyword searches and get different papers coming up. And the citation numbers would be different. It was really interesting that was a problem. So we had to go through other things. So, you go in incognito mode. But, as a researcher, that's really fucking irritating because I might have used 80 papers in mine that I did, but I guarantee you I probably read another half of that and thought they were shit, and I'm not including them. So you end up looking through all these papers. By the time you're done, some academics are amazing at naming papers. Some are just like generic word, generic word, generic word. And then another paper is that, but like in a different permutation. And it's really hard to differentiate. So, I mean, I really like the purple links for that one reason.
As well, with these two organizations, membership in them is not closed, and membership in them is not expensive. I'm a member of both. It costs me less than $200 a year. For this, I can access so many papers in ACM every month, so many in IEEE per month. Some of your larger employers are likely subscribers to one of these two as an institution, and so you may find that magically, if you try to access the paywalled paper from work, it might just not be paywalled anymore. Access to these is usually mediated behind proxies and network access controls and things like this. Another thing with them, too, is that with ACM, you can subscribe to a magazine, such as Communications of the ACM, that will distill what's going on in the field for you. And the purpose of this is to help you keep up to date. So, I mean, I don't mean to plug for them. I'm not really affiliated with them in any way beyond being a member, but I personally find them useful. And in fact, one of the papers that we have at the end of this talk in our reading list showed up in my mailbox from one such description as I was packing to leave for this conference.
And the other thing with these, too, is if you've ever gone to school and you still have your school email address, you can usually still sign up for an account and at the student price, which is like $10. So, kind of nice.
See if your old institutional login still works in the library.
That's very true, too.
I hope they don't stop that.
The other thing here, too, is that you can also go straight to the authors. So the thing with authors is that their CVs, again, are based on citations. But other things they can do is if they do seminars or presentations, that's also how you can get grants. That's also how you can get people to pay attention to you. Also, your press coverage. If you get press coverage for your university, yeah, they're going to want to fund you. Like, talk about the people who did car hacking, right? And they were working with University of Washington for some of that. University of Washington has got so much attention from other schools for that. Like, I still have that mentioned in my school occasionally, too. So doing that sort of thing for an author and using their work for that, they will probably hand you their paper because there's nothing stopping them from giving you a PDF, emailing it. So when you're going through those Google Scholar searches, look at who the author is and find their email. It's usually posted and just say, hey, I'm currently doing this. I'm going to be using or I'm looking for research that'll support this, 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 and I really like this paper. Can you give me a copy? And yeah, they hand it out like candy. Just ask. So if you're frustrated by these paywalls, just approach people, talk to them. Same thing you do at this conference to get information. Just be a friend. And that's how you can get things from academics as well. So again, you can go through these groups or you can go straight through the academics. The other thing we already discussed was, walking into the library, seeing if a computer's unlocked, printing a paper. I can't really, support that, but, it's a thing that can happen.
Yeah, my alma mater, they weren't locked. You just walked in there.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, you pay the dollar for the photocopy.
I mean, use your phone, take pictures of the screen, whatever.
Some institutions will restrict access to the library. Stanford, generally, I think, will allow you, 3 days per year to go in for free. The place where I went to school, University of Lethbridge, literally, if it is open, you can just walk in. All of the computers with access to the journals are unlocked, and you can just go through them. University of Calgary is the same way for most journals, not legal ones, but the rest, you can just use them.
So the guy saying shh in the front. Hi. So some librarians are very supportive of getting information out there. Some librarians will actually give you this information themselves. If you walk up to a librarian and ask and say, I need access to this paper for this research I'm doing, some of them will say yes. Not as many, but there's an opportunity. And I mean, come on, how many of you social engineer in here? Right? You might be a student who forgot their card, forgot their number. I don't know. There's ways to do this.
They're scrupulous about copyrights. They're not trying to deny you access. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, in the back.
Microphone?
Just as another point, a lot of the journals will contact institutions about IP ranges they have leased, and as long as you pull an IP from that institution, you'll get access to the journals. So
Absolutely.
sometimes if you can sneak onto the Wi-Fi or they have guest Wi-Fi, it's still good enough to get to the journals.
Yeah, the
Yep.
university is a beautiful mecca of getting access to the academic content, and if you can involve yourself in any way with your local university or get to know some students or academics, that is our point. How you get the paper is that way.
Exactly. And again, like that's the thing is talk to authors, talk to other people, because even if you're like approach an academic and say, hey, I want to do this project, they might be willing to help you. They might be like, yeah, of course, I want to get on this too. Can we write a paper on this?
Together.
Like together, and bring people from the industry into academia. That's one thing I've been trying to do as well, is when there's people in industry who've been doing amazing work and aren't getting the, reputation they need, or they're not getting enough notice, I'm like, how would you like to write a paper on this? And help them form that idea into a format that will work for a conference. Because that's the thing too, is what academics do is a lot of fitting things into very specific frameworks, very specific ideas, and like having to word things in certain ways. And that's something we are experts at. Let us help you. So if you have a project that you want to get published, approach an academic. We want to be your friends. We're here to get that information back and forth because science is the most important thing.
And if writing a paper is not your jam, I totally understand. There are also a whole bunch of grant programs. One of the larger ones is SITR, STTR, that are specifically targeted as a qualification criteria to pair off a small business and an academic research laboratory to write a paper and also make a product. It's a thing.
So next thing is, how do you revive abandoned academic tools? So as I said earlier, this is my week off from my research. And it's something that I love my research, and I'll probably keep going with it. But there are many people that as soon as they're done, they're like, just fuck that, I'm out. And they will drop whatever tools they've made, whatever they've done to make their thesis work, because they are so sick of the topic. You spend 5 years on one thing, and one thing that's so narrowly focused, you sometimes just want to like leave it and run away. Open a ramen shop in Chicago, sell some waffles on the side, like you're just out.
And cleaning up that technical debt once that project is over and you got just enough of it done to finish your thesis and drop it on the floor, that, to an academic who's trying for tenure or something like this, is totally yak shaving and is a task with no reward.
So this is one of the things. If you want to revive academic tools, offer to take over the project when the person's done. Because if you touch their tools or their research or anything while they're writing a thesis, they can't use it. They have to remove it from their research, and they have to do that much more to finish. Even if it's just like a little thing like fixing that bug, that's something that could get them in trouble, and they might not be able to use that tool as part of their research anymore. So it is they've got a lock on that, and until after, you can't do anything. Microphone?
We're not all students either. We're not all subject to this restriction all the time. So check if the person is a student as you get to know them. And if they're a student, this might apply. If they're a professor who's done, it probably doesn't. Go ahead.
Could you elaborate on exactly why a person would be considered
Yes.
a project contaminated if somebody else worked on it?
Because when you're writing your thesis or dissertation, it has to be your work and your work alone. It's a proving thing. It's how you get the next degree.
Because, like, the point of science, and when you're a researcher, there's this bubble, and this is your research bubble. And when you do your research and you finish your thesis, your bubble gets this much bigger. All of science, just like one little divot on it, and that's what you've contributed. Yay! So satisfying. But that little bubble has to be yours. That is your master's. You're the master of that topic, or you are, like, that's how you earn your doctorate in a topic, is being the one person who added that pin to the map. And so, like, that's just, it's how you prove yourself, and it's trial by fire and tears and blood and sweat. But that's the thing, is just no touchy. So it ends up being a bit of a relay race. So as soon as the person's done, be there to pick up that baton. Be there to be the one they can hand it off to. Or, like we said before, offer to collaborate. Because if they're not a student and they're just a researcher, fuck yes, please help me. There are times where I've had to take a robot and build a graphics pipeline for it, so I can do some graphics work for bounding boxes on it to see a ball on a field of white lines. And there's a couple people in the audience that know exactly what that's like. And you have to do this all from scratch. You can't use some of the other tools sometimes if it's your research that you're doing. So it's nice when there are people there to collaborate on if you're not writing your thesis specifically. And some of these things you can even offer to give in-kind gifts to the researchers, whether if anybody has any robots or IoT devices they want to drop off, please give them to me. But the in-kind gifts are huge for researchers as well because you only have so much grant money. So offer to take it over, offer to be there to work through it with them at the very end so they can give you a description before they run away to their ramen shop. The other thing here too is talking about that technical debt. Be neighborly. Realize that yes, they're probably done with this. They probably haven't fixed any of the code. It's probably written worse than a first year writing their first Hello World program. It's not meant to be seen by people. That one researcher with 13,000 citations does not release any of their work because it is so badly written. It is just so disgusting. They're like, no, it would actually destroy my reputation to put this out there. And so that's another thing too, is if you're taking over this project, this is something you need to be aware of, is how much these researchers probably hate their own code, and it makes them scared every day when they look at it. So offering to help them with that technical debt when they pass it off is very important.
I talked to a person at Oakland who had written a disassembler, and they found that it actually performed better in a usability test that was standard than IDA Pro, and got the reversing done just as well. And I asked them, so when do I get to use this disassembler? And he said, oh, I'm never publishing it. I would be embarrassed if my students saw this code. So please, offer to take it over just yourself. Sometimes they will be more apt for that than posting it on public GitHub.
And so how does information flow from industry to academia? Well, popular media. Researchers get our inspiration from some of the things you all do. If you have a crazy project that ends up getting any attention, that's inspiration for us. Because it's oh, they did that. I wonder if they could do this, 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 this. You get out your notepad, you start making your plans, you start thinking of your literature review. And popular media is one of those great inspirations for us. And so our articles, sometimes it is in a journal that we don't normally read, and it might not be written by an academic. It could just be an editorial journal with an article. And we subscribe to those to get inspiration as well. It's absolutely fantastic. Or even, I don't have it on here, but watching videos from these cons really inspires me for sure. And this is our favorite, open source tools. I love when there are open source tools that will do exactly what I need available on GitHub. It's the biggest support I could get.
Yeah, there's two tools actually that I wanted to call out as an intersectionality sort of topic here. The first one is called Tamron, and you've heard of Tamron?
Yes.
Oh God.
You're a favorite audience member.
Suddenly. So you what?
Wide regard, the protocol, it's Tamron.
Oh, exactly. And that's what it's for. He said wide regard, I believe.
Wire.
Oh yes, okay. Wire. The Wire app its protocol is proved with Tamron. So is TLS 1.3. Large parts of it. Whenever you write a paper with TLS 1.3, you could pretty much put Tamron into Google Scholar and find all the papers on TLS 1.3. This is an example of a tool that's written by academics that's used sometimes, as we've just found out today, in industry and by academia. It's kind of hard to use. It requires a little bit of a learning curve. I'm super stoked to see someone else who knows anything about it. But it's a tool that effectively does a lot of the symbolic analysis or sort of heavy lifting for you, if that sounds familiar. Symbolic execution. If you've ever used Coverity, you've used symbolic execution, and this is a tool that uses the same techniques from academia to help you with that. Another tool that I wanted to talk about is called ostinato. And this tool is really cool if you're doing any kind of network analysis. Every single paper that has to do with like the performance of something, I put a whole bunch of them there over like particular types of physical links. We use ostinato to generate traffic at wire speed to test whether or not it works as it's intended to. So you can use these tools today. Ostinato was a tool that was actually not developed by academia, but it came from industry. And it was just so usable that people carried on the work that people did to develop ostinato in order to try and do their own kind of extension to it. And it's an example of how if you do your thing right and explain what you did and leave some artifacts like publishing your source code and making an application that's kind of sort of maintained-ish, then academics will happily take it up and do all of the heavy lifting work and the work that may be hard for you to do. If you don't have access to off-the-shelf 60 gigahertz wireless hardware, you may not be able to do that study on the bottom there, but because you wrote ostinato, someone else was able to do it and now we know.
And the other thing about academia is like, after one tool is brought in and you hear somebody talk about it in a presentation, it proliferates fast. And everybody is using it all at once. All of a sudden, you hear it in every single paper the next year because everybody's solving the same problem at the same time with their own tools that they're creating from scratch, and it gets really overwhelming. So yeah, we're actually like
almost out of time.
Yeah, almost out of time. So are there any questions anybody has right now? Microphone?
So you brought up the 8-page length issue. One thing that's been brought up by a couple different academics has said is the oversimplification of complex issues is leading to a greater problem than we've ever thought it would. Do you think that forcing or pigeonholing these complex issues into an 8-page, like, you might as well be tweet?
Sort of. It has to do again with that old process of narrowing and broadening and making sure that you can actually do the thing within your allotted time. You have like a publication cycle. You should publish a paper every year or two if you can. And so sometimes when there's a complex issue like that, you have to analyze the entire body of work, multiple papers by the same authors in the same lab to really get a full picture of what's going on. You have to read systemization of knowledge type papers to figure out what's happening. And journal articles rarely have a page limit that's that intense. They're often 40 or 50 pages long. If you're interested in that much nuance, you can totally pick those up and read them.
So yeah, the answer is there are some that are longer, but for conference journals especially, that short page length, I've run into that problem a few times, is reading some of them and it's just like, okay, but what about this? What about that? What about this? And it's like, but you're not thinking this edge case or that edge case. And then you see what cited that paper since, and they've written another paper that covers one edge case, another paper that's written, done another edge case. But they redo about a third of the paper every time because you need that background. So that is usually what ends up happening is it's like, you know, paper part 1, paper part 2, paper part 3, paper part 4, and you just follow that person's body of research and you can get that. But in the meantime, it's just like get that sound bite out. So it is a bit like a tweet, and to get the full picture, that's why we spend months and months and months on a literature review, is to make sure you get all the surrounding papers and not just that one.
And when I see that paper that's incomplete and I can't find that work, there's my opportunity if I was looking for something to do.
And it's usually something, the great thing is if you ever have a research paper you really like and you're reading it, there's usually a future work section of everything they wish they could do. And if you want to make that one thing happen, that's a great opportunity to do that collaboration. Any other questions?
Right, so being as we are almost out of time, we won't be able to get through all of the papers that we put on our reading list. I'm going to see if it's possible to publish these slides and maybe we can get that out there. But I want to talk about how to read papers instead. Because it's kind of, they can be a slog, as you might have noted. It's a slog. So what we do is we make a multipass sort of reading of them. And Straith actually pointed out a paper to me that's kind of de rigueur that describes this process, which we identify on the bottom left. You can visit that link. It'll go to the paper. This is a thing that we call a locator. So anyway, what you do is you start by reading the abstract, which says like why they wrote this at all, what the point of it is. You can then skim it. Skim it by reading the headings. The headings concatenated together kind of make a short form version of what the paper is all about. Then read the introduction, of course. I mean, the introduction is supposed to give you the background knowledge necessary to understand like why they're even doing this study and what kinds of things are the problems that they're trying to solve or what their aspirations for this research are. Then skip the whole thing and read the conclusion and see what did they find? Was it important? Do I care about this at all? Because the whole middle of the paper is like, what are we doing and how did we get to this conclusion? What are the parameters of our study? It's a waste of time to read if the conclusion is not going to help you. Then when you're done with this process, you get to make a decision. Would you like to throw it away and find a new one, or would you like to pore over it and figure out exactly how they did it and what all the limitations on their findings are, read all the graphs and see exactly what it is that they're trying to document here?
And this is the thing, is like, I had to read about 12 papers before I didn't want to scratch my eyes out doing it. It did take a bit of skill to understand how to go through these and how to do those multipass, because I thought I had to read it like a fantasy book. I had to read it in order, step by step, and like stop and like actually pour over that one point until I understood it. But doing this process, you really get to understand where you want to go with it, whether it's useful, and exactly like how you can contribute to what that work does after. Any last questions? I think we have 1 minute.
The graph doesn't have axis layers.
That's right.
Thank you.
You're supposed to do a critical reading of this paper and discover as much.
It could be in the lower right corner. You don't know that.
Yeah, with that, I think that we're just about out of time unless this includes a question. No, it's 5-2. So we'll be around. If you have any questions for us later, we're both on Twitter.
I can get it.
Okay, you get it. We're both on Twitter, and of course, always available in the community. If there's some thing after you've read our papers that you're wondering why we chose them, or if you're wondering how to talk to an academic, or if you have a difficult research problem that you're just not finding a solution to, or if you're wondering, like, I have this tool and I'd really like to get into this area of research, but I just can't get anyone to talk to me.
We are your friends. We are your neighbors. Come say hi.
It sounds like what like black hat hackers say to get people's passwords.
I don't want to touch your computer.
I'm not going to ask you for your password. I don't want to know.
I'll get my robot to do it.
Her robot will get your password.
We'd like to thank Falcon and Brittany for an excellent talk.